Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to The Plant Path. I'm your host, Sajah Popham, and in this episode, I want to discuss the assessment of the Constitution through the use of the natal chart. So, talking about constitutional theory and its relationship to medical astrology. And I can remember way back during my Bastyr days, and being introduced to the concept of the Constitution in regards, not the Constitution in a political sense, but obviously I was introduced to our American Constitution prior to being in college. No, from more of a traditional medical system perspective, the Constitution. And I immediately really took to this concept. That's not really a concept. It's a truth. To me, I took to this truth because it is really at the root of a holistic approach to a person. It is one of the primary ways that we are able to look beyond the symptom of a person and see into the underlying causative factors that are unique to the individual. This is key because as holistic herbalists, we want to treat the whole person, right? We want to be holistic. And we want to be cautious not to excessively fall into that allopathic trap, which is treating the disease, treating the symptom, without consideration of the underlying root causes. Now, of course, there's a case to be made where you want to address symptoms, right? Because symptoms don't feel good and they make you suffer, and we want to, relieve suffering to the best of our ability and to provide relief for people, but not in a suppressive way. I think that's the key, is that there is a way to address a symptomatic pattern in a non-suppressive manner, and even in a way that is in accordance with the vital force of the person, moving with the vital force of the person. Well, how do we understand the vital force of the person? Really, through an understanding of the Constitution. The Constitution of the person, the constitution of the disease, of the symptom, and then we are able to therefore match our therapeutics in accordance with that. Why is this important? Well, because you can have three different people with the same symptom with three completely different underlying causes. Take a headache, for example. There's all kinds of different headaches, right? People can have the location of the headache. Is it occipital? Is it temporal? Is it frontal? Is it vertex? Where is the headache located? Is it pounding and throbbing and explosive, or is it dull and achy and not sharp and stabbing? Like, what's the nature of the pain? There's all these different factors that go into headaches, and you can have three different people with three very different types of headaches that would receive three very different therapeutic courses of action based on those specificities. This is why I think in many instances people try herbs and they don't work, is because they're not used in a way that is considering the constitution of the person, the constitution of the symptom, and lacking that specificity, the herbs don't work. And this is why you can't just have a headache formula that's universally going to work for everyone. It might work for some, but not for others. And so the constitutional model is at the root of a majority of our traditional systems of herbal medicine. Of course, very popular these days would be the constitutional model of Ayurveda with the three doshas, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. Now, one thing that I think is very interesting, since I'm going to be weaving in some of the astrological stuff here with the Constitution, is that actually, if we consider the fact that commonly in Ayurveda there are dosha combinations. Like, it's not just that there's pure vata, pure pitta, and pure kapha. Is that typically there's a dominant or a secondary, a dominant and a secondary constitutional ruler. So you have two. Sometimes one's physical, one's mental. Sometimes one aspect is predominant of one dosha and another aspect of another dosha is predominant. For example, you might have the excess heat of pitta, but you have the dryness of vata. So you would have a pitta vata dosha. So you can have pitta, kapha, vata. You can have pitta vata, pitta kapha, vata kapha, and then the tridosha pattern, vata, pitta, kapha, 7. And I've actually correlated those 7 constitutional patterns to the 7 inner planets of astrology. That's something I outlined in my book, Evolutionary Herbalism. If you don't have a copy of Evolutionary Herbalism, be sure to check it out. Head on over to Amazon and pick up a copy. And we actually give away a free 5-week course for those of you that get a copy of the book. So check that out. So 7 planets, 7 dosha patterns. Very interesting. Chinese medicine, of course, has its constitutional pattern with its 5 elements. Traditional Greek medicine, right? The Greeks had their 4 humors, which of course is very much so reflected in the Unani system. So lots of different constitutional systems, east, west, north, south. And to me, it's a universal understanding. It is basically the postulation that, hey, there are patterns in nature and there are patterns in people that can readily be observed and witnessed and understood as being contributing factors to disease, and to actually treat the person holistically, we need to consider those. So one of the things that I like about the Ayurvedic model, just to talk a little bit more about constitutional stuff before I get into the astrological bit, is the differentiation that in Ayurveda, that there is a core constitution that we have from the moment we are born. So we emerge into this world, we take our first breath of life, and at that moment, it's kind of in the astrological model, it would say that the celestial forces are impressed upon the person's nature. Wherever the planets are currently, they kind of stamp the person with their influence, both psychologically, temperamentally, spiritually, and physically, right? The astrological archetypes, signs, planets, elements, all impress themselves upon the person and have a strong degree of influence over our nature. That in Ayurveda is referred to as prakruti, right? Your core constitution that you are born with. And a lot of that determines your nature, right? You can readily see it in kids, right? When you are kind of embodying your constitutional nature to its fullest, right? Because we haven't, hopefully, put on too many layers on top of that constitution, and a lot of, I would say, our work is to, if we're trying to live a healthy life, a healthy lifestyle, a lot of that really comes down to doing our best to live in accordance with our constitutional nature, not doing things that will drive it into a state of excess or deficiency, but trying to maintain a little bit of balance, and how to do it without becoming completely neurotic about it. And this is something that I kind of really like talking about more and more. Well, I don't like talking about it, but I find that I need to talk about it more and more, because the more I've taught constitutional systems to people, the more I've interacted with people that have a familiarity with it, I noticed a theme, and that some people can take it a little bit too far, right? Where it's like they become overly picky or overly sensitive or overly neurotic about it, right? Where it's like they have to eat at this time of day and they never can have any salt or never can have a pinch of black pepper on their food and never eat some hot sauce or never eat a cold salad or whatever. It's just like, it's a little overboard with it. So I would say, it's good to have an understanding of these things, but it's also good to enjoy your life and keep like anything in balance. Okay, so anyways, I digress. You've got your prakruti, and you'll have to excuse, I probably am mispronouncing these words, but you have your core constitution. And then as you live, you interact and you interface with things, much like in the post I talked about a couple weeks ago about constitutional imbalance, disease, and all the points in between those. So you live your life, and maybe you do eat a little too much ice cream and are a couch potato and aggravate kapha. Or maybe you do eat too much cold, dry food and don't get enough sleep and run around all anxious all the time and aggravate vata. Or maybe you are constantly angry all the time and eating a bunch of hot, spicy foods and aggravating pitta. Well, what ends up happening is you get these layers put on top of your core constitutional nature. Maybe there are times where the vital force is suppressed, or maybe there's times you contract some sort of disease or illness, or you live in a certain environment and you have certain habits. And you get these layers placed upon that core constitutional nature, which in Ayurveda is referred to as the vikruti, your assumed constitution. Vikruti is in and of itself essentially a pathological pattern, or maybe to make it sound a little less scary, it's a relative state of imbalance. Sometimes it's very mild, sometimes it could be more severe. So that is a very interesting understanding, in my opinion, that you have a core constitutional nature, and then you have an assumed constitutional nature, which is kind of where you are now in relation to that core constitutional nature. Well, for any of you that are in the world of astrology, that sounds quite a bit like the difference between a natal chart and a transit chart, right? That your natal chart is the kind of snapshot of the moment of birth. And the celestial influences and terrestrial influences, since we're talking about the elements, that have stamped themselves upon you. And so that natal chart represents that core constitution. But of course, the solar system, the universe doesn't stop just because you were born. Everything keeps moving. Everything keeps changing. Everything is in constant flux. And that is what we would refer to as the transit. So if you could, for example, for those of you not familiar, you could say, take a transit chart for you today, which would be your core chart, your natal chart, kind of in the middle. And then on the outside, there's like a dial that shows where all the planets are now in relation to your natal chart. So how the current position of the planets are affecting you right now. That is, in a lot of circumstances, the vikruti, right? It's the current state in comparison to the core state. And it's actually, that's actually pretty clearly represented in the chart, right? Where your core constitution, my glasses got all kinds of smudges on them here, where your core constitutional nature is in the middle, the natal chart, or the radix, as it's commonly referred to, well, maybe not as commonly referred to, but as it was classically referred to, the radix, the root, is at the center, and then the transits are on the outside. Okay, so, and there could potentially be an argument made for progressed charts also to be representative of vikruti. Personally, I don't use progressed charts too much. I just use transits mostly, and that usually, natal and transits usually gives me everything I need to know. Okay, now, a key confusion that I have noticed consistently is, this is an important part I want to talk about, because there is one thing that I notice over and over and over again that people getting into wanting to study medical astrology and astro-herbalism and constitutions, there's a one big thing that everyone typically gets really confused about, and it's so common that people get confused about this that I feel like I need to acknowledge that. But before I talk about that number one confusion people get, I want to make sure that you know about what is happening right now at the School of Evolutionary Herbalism. We are at the tail end of the enrollment period for our 2026 Astro Herbalism session. We're at the tail end of our free workshop series, the Astro Herbalism mini course. But we're just getting ready to close our special 2026 enrollment period for the full Astro Herbalism program. This is my most in-depth, comprehensive course digging into traditional medical astrology and its synergy with modern clinical herbalism. This is not just big laundry lists of what plants are ruled by certain planets or what plants are related to certain signs. This is an in-depth analysis of the fundamental principles of herbal medicine, how we understand the way in which herbal medicines work, and relating that to the fundamental principles of astrology, from the elements to the modes to the planets, the signs, their reflections within the human organism, anatomically, biochemically, pathologically, psychologically, emotionally, and even spiritually, and into the properties of the herbs, their chemistry, their taste, their actions, their energetics, their medicinal properties, their therapeutic virtues, how to formulate them. This is a comprehensive system of uniting clinical herbalism with traditional medical astrology, and we've got it on sale right now, but enrollment is closing tomorrow, Friday, at midnight. So be sure to head on over to evolutionaryherbalism.com, click the link somewhere on the homepage to get all the details. There should be a banner up somewhere over there or something like that. To click, get all the details on the Astro Herbalism program. Our 2026 enrollment period closes tomorrow at midnight, so be sure to check it out while you can. Get in there, add a discount, some added bonuses. We sweetened the pot, so check it out. So there's a confusion that I notice a lot of people have when they get into studying astrology and herbalism, especially with the constitutions, which is, they hear about the constitutional pattern of a sign of the zodiac, right? Maybe they hear Geminis tend to be slender and thin and maybe a little more nervous and anxious. In Ayurvedic terminology, we would say they're a little more vata in nature, right? They're more ectomorphic in quality. And someone goes, well, I'm a Gemini and I don't match that at all. I'm not that way at all. That's not my constitution. This whole system must be bunk, they say, right? And well, the key problem with that is that your sun sign is not your constitution. Okay, we have this kind of thinking a lot in the West where we think that everything in astrology really orients around the sun. And while in some ways it's true, right? Because it's the gravitational center of our solar system, right? So it does kind of make sense that it is at the center, but there's a lot of other players going on here with astrology. And while the sun, of course, is important, all the other planets are important too. And all the signs are important. But the sun sign is not necessarily your constitution. There are some instances where the sun and the sign it's tenanting might play a little bit more of an importance for the constitution in a man. And the moon sign might play a little bit more of a constitutional importance for a woman. But that's like quite low, I would say, on the list of areas to check to kind of determine the constitution of a person through the astrological chart. So your sun sign is not your constitution. There are other areas of the chart that are a bit more important to look at when deciphering your constitution. And I would say that the most important area of the chart to start at is the rising sign. So for those of you perhaps not familiar, if you're looking at your chart from your perspective, the rising sign is on your left side, right? When you're looking at a chart, it's on the left side, which is the eastern horizon. And, all the planets from your orientation are moving like this. So when it's coming up here, that's rising in the east. So the rising sign represents the quality of the force that is rising up and outwards from you. It is like the energy that emanates from you. In a lot of ways, everything kind of has to filter through that rising sign in order to be expressed. This is why the rising sign is typically thought of, in a lot of ways, it's like your ego. It's the way in which you are able to interact with the world. It is the part of you that interfaces with the outside world. So always it's thought of as the personality, which I think is very interesting. The personality is the root persona. The root of that word means to mask. So I think that's interesting. Here we have our sun is our essence. It's the core of who you are. And yet on top of that, we have this mask, this personality that we interact with the world with. And of course, the mask isn't a problem. It's not a problem to have an ego or a personality. I think the goal is to have it just match, right? To have there be congruence between your personality and your ego with your spirit, with who you are, and not have an incongruency there. So the sun is the central core self, the personality, the spirit, and the rising sign is the quality of the personality that interfaces with the world. This is why when you have a friend, when you just meet someone, really what the energy, right, that you, so to speak, that you're feeling from them or that you're interacting with is the rising sign. And it isn't until you really get to know that person on a deeper level, right, that you enter into deeper conversations about kind of like, hey, when you ask the question, like, who are you? Like, what do you value? What's important to you? What is the core nature of you? Like, who are you, right? That's when you start to get to know their sun. So you usually don't get to know someone's sun until you have those deeper conversations, kind of answering that bigger question of who are you? Because that's what the sun is. And it all just kind of gets filtered through that ascendant or rising sign. So the rising sign or the ascendant powerfully influences the constitution. In a lot of ways, it's said to just be the body, right? It is very much so reflective of the nature of your body. So it's the shape, the structure, the qualities of the body, the overall characteristics that you might see, say, in the face and the eyes and the hair and the limbs and the skin and all those different characteristics, even down into inside the body, right? It's not just physiognomy of like what you look like, but it's also physiological in the sense of what is the state of the inside of the body? Are there any organ systems or tissues that tend to be excessive or deficient or strong or weak or have a tendency towards having health problems? And this is why it's really critically important for medical purposes. So what I like about the astrological model here, before I get into some of the more details, is that this is very precise. Okay, so in Ayurveda, it's like we have, say, Pitta. Well, Pitta is, or the fire element. Well, in astrology, you have 3 fire signs that express that Pitta quality very differently, right? You have Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius. You also have Mars. You also have the sun. So these are all kind of the Pitta qualities, but what you get here is a much more specific way in which that fiery quality is going to be expressing itself. It's more nuanced in a lot of ways. And it's not to say you can't figure that kind of stuff out just through, say in this example, classic assessment techniques used in Ayurveda to determine more the specific ways that person is embodying and expressing those Pitta qualities. But through the natal chart, you can really just see it kind of right in front of you. And that can be very helpful to guide your therapeutic strategies for the people that you work with. So the first thing that you look at is, what is the sign rising? This is the sign of the first house. Whereas you'll see on a chart an AC that stands for ascendant. What sign is the ascendant in? And that sign has a certain element, right? Is it earth, water, air, or fire? It has a certain mode, cardinal, mutable, or fixed, and it has a certain planet associated with it. I call that the energetic architecture of the sign. It's like a constellation of forces that all come together to generate the specific qualities and characteristics and virtues and vices of that sign. Each sign governs a certain area of the body, starting with Aries at the top of the head and running down the body with Pisces at the bottom of the feet, and all the internal organs and systems and tissues have their correlations to those signs of the zodiac. So you look to the architecture of that sign, and that gives you a lot of clues as to the constitutional nature of that person. That Gemini person, right? A Gemini is composed of the air element in the mutable mode, which mutable is like changeable in quality, which is a very Vata quality. And it's governed by Mercury, right? The planet of quickness and swiftness and communication, and rules the lungs and the nervous system and the pairs, the arms, the hands, speech, communication, the mind, right? So that Gemini rising person might be a little more active and movement oriented, and they might embody more of that Gemini constitutional picture, that air, mutable air, mercurial type quality. Even if there may be a Taurus sun, right? They might be a solid Taurus sun type person, but the rising sign, right, might be Gemini. And so they hear the Gemini descriptors and they're like, well, or they hear the Taurus descriptors of constitution and they're like, that's not me at all. I'm not solid and dense and stubborn and reliable and, I'm much more flighty. And it's like, well, you have that Gemini on the ascendant. So you can look to the sign that's right. That's step number one. Look at the rising sign. Step two is you look and see, are there any planets either in the first house, or even more importantly, are there any planets conjunct or next to the ascendant? And that would be that specific planet is rising up and out. The sign is like just the general region, right? The area. But if there's a planet rising, that specific quality is rising up and out of you. That will actually take precedence over the sign. That planet becomes much more important of a constitutional ruler than the sign actually is. So that's very important to look at that. So if the person, say, has the moon rising on the conjunct the ascendant, well, they might have, the moon can manifest in a couple different constitutional patterns. The general polarity would be the full moon type and the new moon type. The full moon type is much more phlegmatic, watery, damp. They tend to kind of hold on to their fluids, and as such, they can also hold on to their waste products. They can tend to accumulate things easily, and that way they can be a kind of a larger constitution, maybe teardrop shaped constitution, thicker, waterier, but the disposition is very tender, very mothering, very nurturing. The opposite is the new moon type, right? Which is, if we think of the new moon, what's the nature of the new moon? Well, it's invisible, it's disappeared. And so the new moon constitutions, they're going to be kind of the opposite. More thin, slender, very reserved, very quiet, very internal, right? Very in their own kind of imaginary world, right? They're they like to just read their books or do their quiet art. They're very quiet, reserved, but they can be slender, thin, anxious, nervous, much more of a Vata type. So the full moon type is more Kapha, the new moon type is more Vata in nature. So you might see that. And whether it's new or full isn't always dependent as to whether they were born on a new or full moon. It's going to have to do with, I would say, the strength of the moon in regards to whether it is in a place of strength or weakness is a good way to think of that, which you typically have to do by looking at its sign placement and its interaction with the other planets. But so the sign rising, any planets conjunct the ascendant, very important. If you don't have any planets conjunct the ascendant and you just have that rising sign, one way that you can get more information is to think, what is the planet that rules that sign? So in that example, we had a Gemini rising. Well, Gemini is ruled by Mercury. Well, now what you can do is look, where is Mercury in the chart? Because by correspondence, there's going to be a little dotted line there that connects the placement of that Mercury back to the ascendant. And in some instances, that the sign that the Mercury in the chart is tenanting, that sign actually might be more of the constitutional ruler. So we were talking about Gemini and Mercury. Maybe someone has Gemini rising and they're like, I don't fit that picture at all. I'm not thin and slender and anxious and nervous and talkative all the time and this, that, and the other. I'm more solid than that, right? Well, maybe you look and, oh, Mercury is in, say, an earth sign like Taurus, or maybe it's in an earth sign like Virgo, which would be a pretty strong placement for that Mercury because Mercury also rules Virgo, but Virgo's an earth sign. And so what you might see is the constitutional nature is of the sign that the planet ruling the ascendant is tenanting, right? So if you got Cancer rising, you would say the moon rules Cancer. Well, where's the moon? Well, maybe the moon is in Sagittarius, and they might have more of a Sagittarius type constitution. So it's not always the rising sign that gives you that qualities. It actually might be the sign that its ruling planet is in. So that's another trick that you can use, but you can see that it's really the rising sign is like the doorway. It's the key. It's like what to look at. And then you see, oh, is that planet in a place of weakness? Is it in a place of strength, right? Is it, if you have, say, Aries rising, which is ruled by Mars, say, is in Capricorn. Well, Mars is in its sign of exaltation in Capricorn. Mars really likes to be in Capricorn, right? Because Capricorn is like, wants to work, it wants to climb the mountain, it wants to achieve something great. And Mars gives it that, it gives the energy that it needs to do that, right? It wants to climb up to the top of that mountain. So Mars is very happy there. That's a strong placement for Mars. In another example, we could say Aries rising. Mars rules Aries. What if Aries is in Libra? That's a sign of detriment because Aries and Libra oppose one another. And so that would be maybe a little bit of a weaker placement for Mars. And I would say in that case, less likely. Of course, there's lots of dynamics to look at in a chart, but less likely for the constitutional pattern to be of that sign because there's a little bit of almost like a, not a conflict, but there's a incongruency between the qualities of Mars and Libra, where it's less likely for that to be impressing itself upon the constitution. So the rising sign, this holds the key for understanding the constitution. Now the constitution is, and the rising sign is the energy that rises out of you. It's a lot of your personality, right? Your personality, your qualities, your characteristics. That in turn influences a very important area of the chart for medical purposes. And because your personality determines kind of how you act every day, right? What you do on a daily basis. So the rising sign, the first house, forms a very important relationship to the sixth house, which is, among other things, referred to as the house of health. It's also referred to as the house of servants or service. It's associated with Virgo by correspondence. The sixth house in a lot of ways has to do with, in a lot of ways, the sixth house has a lot to do with kind of the mundane reality, right? It has to do with kind of your just day-to-day life. It's the nitty-gritty details of your daily life. And has a lot to do with your work that you do, the work that you do every day. That's why it has a lot to do with skilled labor. It has a lot to do with apprenticeship, like learning from someone a skill that you do to do your work. Of course, it forms this interesting relationship in the Earth trine where, it feeds back to the second house in Taurus, which has a lot to do with your your money, right? Your finances, your resources. A lot of second house like resources. And that also feeds into your 10th house, which has a lot to do more with your career, or like your greater works in kind of like the public eye. But the 6th house is like your skilled labor, which you do every day. Well, what determines your health in a lot of instances? That what you do every day. Your habits, your patterns, your rhythms, or lack of them is going to determine the state of your health. So the rising sign in the 6th house form what's called a quincunx, a 150-degree relationship between signs. And the way I was taught medical astrology, that 150-degree relationship is probably one of the most important medical aspects in a chart. Because what it does is it shows areas of weakness. So typically, a kind of a simplified way of thinking about it is that the first house is your rising sign, your ascendant, okay? The nature of your ascendant, your constitution, tends to generate a particular weakness in the body, an area that you might be a little bit more prone to having some health problems. Maybe when you get sick, that's the area of the body that you get sick. It might lend insights into potential, problems that you might face in the future might be revealed there in the 6th house. And so, but there's typically, if you're doing a whole sign house system, you're getting a very specific pattern there in terms of the relationship between the signs of the zodiac. So we were talking earlier about a Gemini rising. Well, if you were to apply 150 degrees, and a really simple way to do this is your quincunx signs are always the sign on either side of the opposite. So if you have Gemini, opposite Gemini is Sagittarius. Well, before Sagittarius is Scorpio, and after Sagittarius is Capricorn. So the two signs that quincunx Gemini are Capricorn and Scorpio. Scorpio would be, if you have Gemini rising, would be the 6th house ruler, the house of health. And that indicates kind of an area of weakness. Now, studying these patterns of relationship can be pretty interesting. You can glean a lot of insight as to the inner workings of the body in a lot of ways. So if we think of the Gemini constitution, might be more, typically is going to be more Vata in nature. Tall, thin, slender, cold, dry, tense, anxious, nervous. What's interesting here is that in Ayurveda, Vata governs the lungs and it governs the large intestine. Well, the quincunx, Gemini, rules the lungs and the respiratory tract. Scorpio, the 150-degree relationship, rules the colon. So that's a pretty interesting correlation there. And that kind of the way I understand this quincunx is that the anxiousness and nervousness and just excess energy of Gemini tends to lack rhythm. It lacks consistency. And it can tend to be anxious and nervous and therefore a little bit more sympathetic in its nervous system stimulation, right? Which is going to affect detoxification. It's going to affect, because Scorpio is the quality of what removes things from the body. It's your detoxification system, basically. It is the organs that eliminate things from the body, the colon, the bladder, the pores of the skin. And so we might see with that Gemini type problems with elimination. There might be constipation. There might be the opposite of that, diarrhea, loose stools. There might be irritation of the bladder nerve, incontinence. There might be urinary difficulties, perhaps excess sweating, perhaps skin conditions like acne, things that affect the pores of the skin, right, due to elimination. So that's the Gemini Scorpio quincunx there. So this is a way of understanding the relationship between the constitution of the person and some of their potential, keyword potential, predispositions for disease, for just health problems that they might face in their daily life. And this is a really powerful pattern to study. Now, you can do a very similar thing with the sixth house that you do in the first house that I described. So first, you would just observe what is the sign of the sixth house ruler. And then you would look at, okay, well, what are the areas of the body that sign governs? As I mentioned with Scorpio, the bowel, the bladder, the reproductive system too. There might be some libido issues actually there with that quincunx. The Gemini anxiousness can sometimes affect libido a little bit because Scorpio governs the genitals. So there's areas of the body. Also looking elementally, right? Is it Scorpio is a water sign, so maybe there's something going on with the water element to just look at. So you look at the sign ruling the sixth house. Now, more important, if you have a planet in that sixth house, that planet becomes much more important of a quality to consider, right? Which might trump the qualities and characteristics of that sign. If there is no planet in the sixth, again, you would look at what is the planet that rules the sixth house sign. So in this case with Scorpio, I would look to where Mars is located, which is the traditional ruler of Scorpio. Even though Pluto is the modern ruler, that doesn't change the fact that Mars still has tons of powerful correlations to Scorpio. And also on a side note, because Pluto is still relatively recently discovered, at least, in the timeline of astrology, it's pretty recent. We haven't really seen the entire rotation of that planet around the entire zodiac yet. So we're still learning about Pluto. And from a medical perspective, it's still kind of like being figured out, being understood. So I tend to rely on Mars a lot for Scorpio. But Pluto can be looked at as well. And that can give you more insights, right? Is the planet that rules the sixth house sign in a sign of detriment or weakness or fall? Is it in a sign of exaltation? Does it have all these harmonious trines and sextile aspects to it? Or is it being a little bit more challenged with squares and oppositions? These are all things to look at to give you a little bit more of a nuanced understanding of what's going on with the sixth house. So this is just a little bit of how to look at the constitutional pattern of a person utilizing their natal chart. This is just kind of like the first areas that you look at. There are lots of other things that can be going on in someone's chart that even trump the rising sign for the constitutional ruler. So I say start with the rising, but there are some other things that can be even more important. I would say top of the list there would be sometimes if there's a stellium, which to me is 5 or more planets in a single sign, that might trump the ascendant. Another would be stationary planets. So a stationary planet is when, planet's going forward and it's getting ready to go retrograde and it slows and then it stops, stationary, and then it goes retrograde and then it slows and it stops. Now it's stationary and then it goes direct. At either of those stationary periods, if someone's born with a planet that's stationary, it's like literally sitting there. Boof, it's really strong. And so that can sometimes be a constitutional ruler. And then the other one I would mention would be if there are a predominance of planets in any one particular element. So say you've got, 9 out of 10 planets in fire signs, but you've got Taurus rising. All those fire signs very well might become much more powerful for the constitutional ruler, just because that's a lot of fire, right? That's a lot of fire. So sometimes you can do that with the modes too. Say you have all cardinal signs or all mutable signs or all fixed signs. That can be contributing, but even that, the modes are very different because, you would think, for example, fixed, like the fixed mode, you'd think, oh, that's kapha, kind of similar to kapha. Fixed, it's inertia, it's kind of stable and solid. It has these kapha qualities, but Aquarius is a fixed sign. Aquarius is not kapha at all, right? It's very vata, cold, dry, tense, thin, weak, deficient are very common qualities of people with strong Aquarian qualities. And I don't mean that as like an insult. It's just part of the nature. So the modes, I don't really think predominance of modes is as strong of an indicator, but a predominance of elements, if you've got all of your planets in earth, water, air, or fire, that's going to be a very strong constitutional indicator that might be more important than the rising sign. But nonetheless, the rising sign is very important because everything ultimately kind of in a way gets funneled through it in order to be expressed outwardly in the world. So thanks so much for joining me here in this episode of The Plant Path. I do appreciate you taking the time out of your busy life to learn a little bit more about the synergy between traditional medical astrology and modern herbalism. If you enjoy this content, if you find it intriguing and interesting, I really want to encourage you to go over to evolutionaryherbalism.com and check out our Astro Herbalism program. Again, we are in the final day of enrollment for our 2026 enrollment period, at least as the day that this is being published. So if you're watching this on the day it comes out or the day after, you still have time to check it out. Again, we are offering a discount on the program right now during our annual enrollment period, along with some extra special bonuses that you get when you enroll now. So check it out. It would be a true honor to have you join me in that program, which I think is one of the most comprehensive explorations of clinical herbalism with traditional medical astrology. If you're watching this on YouTube, hey, if you don't mind taking a moment, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. It really does help support the channel. I've got a goal. I have a goal. I really want to reach 100,000 on YouTube this year. So help me make it happen. If you're listening to the podcast, if you could just take a minute and leave a 5-star review if you enjoy The Plant Path, that really does also help. And of course, if you're not on our email list, go to evolutionaryherbalism.com, sign up somewhere on there so you can get notified for when we're enrolling in our courses, when we're doing more in-depth workshops. Of course, this last week and a half, we've been doing our Astro Herbalism mini course, which is a 100% free workshop series. You could binge the whole thing right now if you wanted to. It'll be open until we close enrollment tomorrow night at midnight. So be sure to check that out. And I do want to say thank you to each and every one of you for being a part of the Evolutionary Herbalism community. Thanks for checking out this post on The Plant Path. I do really appreciate it. And until the next one, take care and be well.